Welcome back to Contracts, guys. This is episode 2. So we're going to pick up from where we left off. We were just talking about Allens versus Panhandle Realty. And in that case, I introduced you to the objective theory of contracts, right? And in that case, the court would use the objective theory of contracts, which we'll come back to a few times, in order to determine whether Mr. Allens and Panhandle Realty had actually reached an agreement that was enforceable. So a contract, so to back up just a little bit, right? We said that a contract is a legally enforceable agreement, right? Supported by consideration with capacity of the parties and legality of purpose, right? So again, legally binding agreement, we'll understand agreement, consideration, capacity, and legality shortly, but for now, legally binding agreement is sufficient. A contract, this agreement has to be based on a promise. It is a statement by one person that they will do something, right? I will love you forever, right? Is a promise, right? That promise is not legally enforceable unless, for example, you get married, but even then it's not really, you're promising to stay married, you're not promising to actually love the person forever, right? That's really not an enforceable promise, right? So the person that initiates this process, right, is the person that makes the promise is the promisor. And the person to whom the promise is made is the promisee, right? The promisee is the person who has the expectation that they'll receive the benefits of the promise. But again, just as with the promise to love you forever, the every promise is not going to be enforceable. And so contract law, again, is the facilitation of, it's the base law that facilitates trade. I can't think of any older law, or partnership law, which you'll get to in business law too, if you pursue that, is also equally ancient. But contracts are even more ancient, thousands of years old. All right, and so the principles that flow through contract law, which first arose in the Mediterranean and then kind of spread through that world, are of course, they're greatly impacted by common law today, but the need to hold people to their promises was an important early tool that would be necessary, like a predecessor for there to be real markets, right? And by markets, I'm not simply talking about places where people sell things. I mean macroeconomic markets, right? So with regard to contract law, we have a couple of sources, right? There is the Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC, which you'll take a look at as well in business law too. There are state laws, all types of regulations if you're going to be contracting in certain areas, or if you're going to be contracting with government to provide services. There are many, many laws that impact contract law, right? So that said, with that caveat in place, contract law allows two or more parties to create any arrangement that they can imagine and have it be the force of law. Think of it as an ability to write a statute that only governs the parties to the contract, right? That is essentially what we call the freedom of contract. Any arrangement that you would seek to extract a promise or to receive a promise, right, can be made legally binding if the proper pieces are in place, right? And those pieces are, again, if you'll sort of look to the PowerPoint: agreement, consideration, contractual capacity, and legality, right? Agreement, consideration, contractual capacity, and legality. Agreement is simply a meeting of the minds. It is composed of an offer that's made by the promisor, and generally, it has to be an acceptance, generally affirmatively made by the promisee, right? An offer made by the promisor and an acceptance made by the promisee. Consideration is the if you do this, then I will do that element, right? It has to be there in every proper contract. So the promise that is made, the thing that makes the promise legally enforceable, is the fact that it was bargained for, right? If you give me your 1970 Mustang, I will give you $14,000, right? That is an offer of $14,000 if you perform the promise of giving me the title to your 1970 Mustang. Now, capacity or contractual capacity is simply the state of both parties being of legal ability to enter into a particular type of contract, right? They have to have the contractual capacity, right? Which, not to use the word to define it, but really it's the ability to enter into that contract, either for legal reasons or for whatever reason, whatever relationship you have to the item under consideration in the contract, right? You have to have capacity to deal with that. Quick example: a 12-year-old does not have contractual capacity to buy cigarettes, so an agreement to do so would not be a contract. An agreement to sell a 12-year-old cigarettes would not actually be a contract. We'll explore that a little bit more as well. With regard to legality, legality simply is what it is. The contract's purpose has to be for some aim that is within the ambit of the law, right? And can't be against public policy. Again, the easy case is, well, if I take out a hit on someone, like if anyone watch Shameless, okay, so it's about this wholly dysfunctional family. And it's a great show if you haven't watched it. Many people do. So if you've heard this one, sorry. But if you watch the show, the father wants to get rid of the daughter's fiance. And so he hires some random guy, right, on the subway to off the guy, gives him money, right? And then he's shocked when the daughter's fiance is not bumped off. Runs into the guy some weeks later. He's like, "Hey, man, I gave you money. You're supposed to bump that guy off." He said, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about." Well, obviously, he can't go to court to claim that he was defrauded out of his $2,500 because this guy would not carry through with the hit. But there was no legality. So he basically just gave him the money, right? So that's one example. That's the easy case. There are other cases that are not so easy because there are contracts that can easily run afoul of the law, right? Because the law is so enormous, and there are many wrinkles in that. But we'll only deal with a couple of them in the time that we have. All right. So, and before we proceed to the classifications of contracts, we should raise a couple of defenses to contract enforceability, because that will become relevant in a little bit when we talk about classification, unenforceable versus voidable versus void contract. All right. So there are two defenses to contract enforceability that I'd like you to be immediately aware of, and they are voluntary consent and form. Voluntary consent and form are defenses, so they need their own rules, right? With regard to voluntary consent, the parties have to actually agree is essentially what I mean, right? The parties have to actually be motivated by the desire to receive a benefit and that's why they're making the promise. This means, it's another way of saying that that promise has to be voluntary, right? Fraud, which is what you've learned about, certain types of mistake, right? For example, I think you're selling me a Watkins sloop, well, bad example. If I think you're selling me a certain one type of sailboat, and I find out that it's another type of sailboat, it's less valuable, right? And we were both wrong, that's a mistake. And then there's coercion, or what's known as duress. Coercion is the application of force through whatever means, right? If I hold a gun to your head, that's, well, in addition to being assault, that's coercive. But if I do something psychological to you, right, that can also be coercion, right? Again, voluntary consent, right? Fraud, duress, and coercion. And the other one is to form. The second one is form. So some contracts have to be in formal, in a sort of formal form, right? And that means that whatever form the law requires, right? For example, checks have to be in a certain form. If you've ever used a check, not many people have anymore, but the checks have to be in a certain form, certain draws on bank accounts, right? You don't just write them up on a sheet of notebook paper. There are contracts that have to be in a certain form. And as also with regard to form, some contracts have to be in writing, which we'll learn about when we talk about the statute of frauds. All right? Thank you very much for your attention to this. Please respond to the prompt below.